So it's a pleasure to be back at Williams. I first arrived here 65 years ago as an entering freshman. That's a lie, actually. I was entering first grade. 20 years ago, I had the pleasure of watching my Amherst daughter, swimmer, outswim Williams and outcompete Williams in water polo. But most recently, I've had the pleasure of teaching at CDE, and it's therefore a particular delight to be here today. I'm too going to talk about the role of the IMF as lender of last resort. As Guillermo demonstrated, discussions of this topic ritualistically begin with Walter Bagehot's dictum about that in a panic a central bank should lend without limit to solvent firms against good collateral at a high rate. I have always wondered why advice penned in 1873 should remain an unqualified doctrine almost 150 years later, when the international monetary and financial system is obviously substantially different than it was then. But as has been amply discussed, the actions of central banks in the global financial crisis have revised debates and stirred new controversies about the lending activities of central banks and whether those should extend beyond the provision of very short-term liquidity to private sector entities, banks, to longer-term support for a broader array of borrowers in the public as well as the private sector, and to markets themselves. And as Guillermo pointed out, one of the central concerns is incentives and the associated potential for moral hazard. And then when you come to the international arena, topic is even more controversial, whether it involves central bank swap lines or occurs via the International Monetary Fund. Because in particular, the lending goes to governments, and governments, of course, differ in many fundamental respects from private firms, including the fact that the distinction between solvency and liquidity is blurred, if it is even relevant. And consequently, those who are preoccupied, largely falsely in my view, with moral hazard concerns with respect to both the borrowing country and those that lend to that country, find these concerns magnified in the international context. Now, as Michael pointed out, in its Bretton Woods conception, the IMF lending was envisioned as assisting countries in financing the adjustment of their current account deficits. However, arguably in the 1980s and certainly by the 90s, capital account crises, including for advanced Asian countries, rather than current account crises, have been most threatening to national and international financial stability and economic growth. Hence, the moral hazard concerns and the periodic calls for private sector involvement have been associated with those operations. And one manifestation of those trends was that the IMF resources were increasingly constrained relative to various aggregates. So between 1983 and the time of the global debt crisis of the 80s and 2003, shortly before the recent crisis, total IMF quotas increased by 140%, but they shrank by 25% relative to GDP in the world, and more than 50% relative to current payments, and even more relative to gross capital flows. And the various ratios declined further in the subsequent 5 years. So when the global financial crisis entered its most virulent phase in September of 2008, the IMF's lending capacity, effective lending capacity, was $250 billion. Remarkably, including the latest bilateral commitments of almost $500 billion to the IMF, the potential total is now $1.25 trillion, a quintupling. I think these events that clearly demonstrate, and Guillermo did in his slides more technically than I'm going to, that we need an international lender of last resort. But the problem is that the IMF is far from flush with financial resources to discharge its lending responsibilities for all its members. And I think an important point is that this illusion, particularly in advanced countries like the United States, that the IMF was all about lending to developing countries, it was an illusion from the beginning, and the notion that it shouldn't have resources to lend to rich countries like Korea, which was essentially the same level of GDP as Greece, per capita as Greece, was something perpetrated by the politicians. So the question is, what should be done to augment the IMF's role as a principal lender of last resort? And I will give you now a 5-part program. First, the IMF's financial resources must continue to expand. It has been agreed that the 15th General Review of IMF quotas will be advanced to January 2014. It is possible that, as of that date, the 2010 agreement on quotas and governance reforms will not have yet have been implemented because of the regrettable inability of the U.S. administration or administrations to gain legislative approval. Nevertheless, the target for the additional agreement in January 2014 should be a further doubling of IMF quotas to produce about $1 trillion in potentially usable quota resources, and converting and augmenting the 2012 bilateral lending agreements into a permanent addition to the IMF's financial resources. The conversion might involve some redistribution of lending, but the point would be to augment the new arrangements to borrow so that they would total $750 billion. So after implementation, the total potential financial resources would be about $1.75 trillion. Now, this may seem like a large number, but it needs to be seen in some historical context, because under the normal timetable, the next review of IMF quotas would not be until 2019 and would not go into effect until several years later. Second, I have long argued that the IMF should put in place and test procedures and mechanisms for it to borrow in the private international capital markets. Doing so would not dramatically augment the IMF's lending capacity, but it might yield a useful $100 to $150 billion at a time of stress. Third, one of the realities of the IMF as a lender of last resort is that it has limited capacity to expand the liability side of its balance sheet and thus the asset side of its balance sheet. The IMF can issue or allocate special drawing rights, but they do not appear on the IMF's balance sheet. However, SDR can be a useful tool, as was demonstrated in 2009 when an allocation of about $250 billion was approved in the depths of the global financial crisis and helped to alter the financial sentiment of the time. I think the SDR tool should be further developed via an amendment of the IMF Articles Agreement that would allow the fund to approve a special temporary allocation of SDR in a declared global crisis. The special allocation might have to be endorsed by the International Monetary and Financial Committee prior to action by the Executive Board, but it should not involve the 85% majority vote of IMF governors that is required for a normal permanent SDR allocation. A majority of the Executive Board, say 60%, might be required, but the subsequent cancellation of SDR over a 5-year period following the declaration of an end to the crisis might require only a majority vote. Fourth, I favor the establishment of a global swap network to augment IMF lending in a financial crisis. I have previously outlined 2 approaches which differ in the extent to which the IMF itself is involved. Under the more IMF-centric approach, an amendment to the IMF articles would authorize the IMF to temporarily exchange specially allocated SDRs with central banks issuing the international currencies included in this SDR basket. That's the dollar, the euro, yen, and sterling currently, in return for their own currencies. And these currencies would be used by the fund to lend to other central banks to support those countries' financial institutions, much as the swap network that was developed during the global financial crisis worked, but it would be institutionalized. One advantage of this approach would be to provide scope for the issuing central banks to use the SDR to obtain foreign currencies if they need to offset the exchange rate pressures resulting from liquidity support operations. Under a less IMF-centric approach, being sensitive to the sensitivities of central banks. The global net swap network could involve three keys to unlock it. The first key would be held by the IMF. Based upon objective criteria, the IMF would declare a global need for liquidity to support the international financial system and recommend that central banks consider providing foreign currency liquidity to private financial institutions in other countries via their central banks. The criteria employed by the IMF should be objective and linked to circumstances associated with heightened extensive external stress events. The second key would be held by the group of central banks that had previously established the swap network. Participation in the global swap network would be predetermined by the central banks involved, for example, based on their independence of the participating central banks and assessments of the stability of their financial systems. The central banks would meet and, using their own criteria, would agree or not with the IMF that there was a global need for liquidity and could and should be met by activating the network. The criteria used by the central bankers should be transparent, but they might differ from those used by the IMF. For example, they might involve greater emphasis on financial conditions and the risk to global inflation. The third key would be held by each individual central bank or pair of central banks deciding to respond to the decisions of the IMF and the central banks collectively with a specific swap operation or sequence of operations. Importantly, no national central bank would be required to activate the third key, and central banks would retain the capacity to enter into swap agreements outside the three key framework. Would national central bank come under pressure to use the third key? Certainly, but those pressures are there already. A structured approach, such as the one I have outlined, would establish a global context for activation of the global swap network and identify those countries that are most deserving of assistance. Finally, to address hypothetical moral hazard concerns, as well as to move general global arrangements more towards a ex-ante rule-based regime, I have proposed combining access to various IMF lending facilities with an augmented role for IMF surveillance, something which I call comprehensive pre-qualification. Comprehensive pre-qualification will work as follows. Every member of the IMF is obligated to have an annual Article 4 consultation and review of its economic and financial policies by the IMF staff and executive board. An integral part of those reviews, the IMF staff should, in the future, indicate the policy terms for lending to every member country potentially eligible to borrow from the fund. For a country with very strong policies and a track record of policy performance, the staff would state its judgment that the country would be eligible to borrow under the flexible credit line. For the country with less strong but sound policies, the staff would also state that the country would qualify for lending under the precautionary liquidity line, under which a country commits to policies that will limit its vulnerability. For the country with weak policies or a weak track record, the staff would outline the necessary change in policies as part of a traditional standby arrangement or perhaps a high access precautionary standby arrangement. This framework would apply to every member country. The IMF Executive Board could comment on the staff recommendation, as it does now on other aspects of Article 4 assessments, but the board would not be required to act on the staff recommendation at that time. Implementation of the approach should be supported by a commitment to make staff reports public promptly without significant modification. As a byproduct, the comprehensive pre-qualification approach would not only deal ex-ante with the moral hazard issue, but also reduce the stigma of borrowing from the fund, because it would be comprehensive in its application, not only just to say Portugal and Vietnam, but also to say the United States and Germany. So in conclusion, the IMF is the principal international lender of last resort. The objective, as Guillermo said, is to support global economic and financial stability. And third, its available resources and tools should be enhanced via the 5-part program I've outlined. Thank you very much.